and it's a lecture that he gave at Holistic Health Forum, and he discusses a lot of these sciences, but most importantly, the implications of what it means and how we're now understanding much more about ourselves. As he's been telling us the last hour, DNA doesn't control us. DNA offers a realm of possibilities, but he says it's really our environment and our own reaction to the environment that can turn off or turn on the various DNA and how or which parts of it get expressed. He's told us about these type of genes called transposons that can actually engineer mutations. There have been studies to confirm this, that we have within us, and most cells have within them genes that can intelligently adapt to new conditions in the environment, that can intelligently rewrite the code as you go. So this is some important new findings on not just nurture versus nature and that old debate, but really on what are we doing with our environment? How are we reacting to the environment? What are we doing around us? What about emotions? Now, Bruce has also told us that our cells have two types of receptors. They have receptors, meaning what you can plug in to give it the information to cause it to unfold or express. Two types of receptors, he's told us: molecular, meaning biochemical, and electromagnetic. That electromagnetic is what gets interesting here. Bruce was just discussing a caller's question about reincarnation. Your own views. Could you restate those on reincarnation, Bruce? And could you give us a quick recap of where we've been for our new listeners just joining us? Go ahead and take your time.
Okay, basically the fact is that cells have identity, and that's why we cannot exchange cells with each other, because your cells have an identity of your character, my cells have my identity, and if I put my cells into anybody else's body, their immune system will say, no, these are not,
they'll say,
they don't
foreign
match
invader,
self.
kill it.
What's that? Yeah. So what they're looking at, they recognize what a self is as being different than everything else, okay?
Yeah.
So basically I say, if I have your liver cell and I have my liver cell, and we know now they're two different liver cells, and I subtract essentially everything that's the same, approximately the same, what my expectation is, what would be left behind would be where the difference is. Okay?
Well, you say that our cells have self-receptor sites, and you were talking about the example of organ donors. The recipients of donated organs start to experience or take on some of the characteristics of the donors. You were explaining that? What was that?
Yeah, because the antennas that receive what self is, they're called receptors, okay? Mm-hmm. These are proteins whose function is to receive information. By definition, they're antennas, okay? They receive an identity of self.
And they act very much like a mechanical antenna.
Well, there's a device that converts a signal, just like you have a television on your house for, an antenna for your television, right?
Right, yeah.
And the antenna catches a signal in the environment and then brings that signal in, and the TV uses that signal, okay? So the antenna catches the signal. The receptors on the cell, called self receptors, capture a signal called self. So something on the outside called self, an identity, a signal like a broadcast frequency, is on the outside that gives identity across these antennas, so that your frequency, whatever that is, comes across your antennas and affects your cells. Uh-huh. My frequency, or wherever source I am, comes across antennas and affects my cells. I have a different set of antennas than you.
And it could be in a electromagnetic fashion, you say. The signal can be delivered
electromagnetically. Vibration is more effective on an energetics level than chemical communication.
Boy.
The cells would prefer to respond to an energetic frequency rather than a chemical frequency, because it's more efficient.
Now, aren't we back to soul and memory and identity? I mean, we are now landed squarely in the realm of metaphysics.
Absolutely, because I am, the reductionist biologist, taking it apart to see its fundamental mechanism, that the ultimate quest is to take it apart and see all the parts and how they work. Yeah. And when I got to the end of the line, what it revealed to me was the parts work by reading the entire environment. So all of a sudden, this narrow reductionist point of view opens up to the reality, says, my God, the system is reading everything. and at that point, it brings back that the cell is a reflection of its environment.
Well, this would also explain the numerous studies on the efficacy of prayer, because prayer would be part of that electromagnetic signal that could come in and actually change the chemistry or change the workings or change what DNA gets turned on or what have you to produce a result.
Absolutely.
This is the
And
mind-body
work like Cleve
connection.
Baxter demonstrates that you can separate your cells from your body, and your cells will express an electrical response at the moment you have an emotional response, even though the cells are 2 or more miles away from you.
Now, I thought he did that with plants.
He did it with humans. He
What-
did it
what
with
was the exact
cells
experiment?
he took cells from a mouth from the mouth where you have these amoeba-like cells, okay?
Yeah.
And then you put them on a dish, and you can grow these cells, and they're your cells. They're actually part of your immune system, and they can respond in a culture dish placed 2 miles away from the guy who donated the cells. And when that person elicits an emotional response, the cells 2 miles away simultaneously, exhibit an electrical activity.
Okay, so our mere emotions must have an electromagnetic component to them, and this would also explain the ability, the mind-body connection, of course, but also they say that when you're happy, they've done these studies, generate happiness, and you have positive biochemicals floating through your system that support health.
Absolutely.
If you're angry or sad or upset or in anxiety all the time, your body's actually putting out detrimental chemicals, but also detrimental electromagnetic frequencies that do their own damage. I'm sure it's
a weakened animal gives off a signal that predators will look for, because it's nature's way of eliminating a weak animal from the group, okay?
Well, I've heard the same from Phil Callahan, who's a plant biologist, and he says that insects have infrared antennae. Their antennae pick up infrared, different frequency than what we see except for machines. And he said they will go after the diseased plants because the diseased plants put off a different infrared signal.
Right.
That say, eat me, take me out of the system.
And that's what happens if we go on the negative side in a chronic fashion. Then we're radiating an ill health frequency that predators pick up on. And unfortunately, predators in the human line, predate differently. They're not necessarily carnivores, but they can certainly catch you off guard. And
human predators know how to pick out their human victims.
Absolutely.
So they're probably just
it's not a
reading the
coincidence.
signals. Oh, boy. Lots of discussion ahead with biologist Bruce Lipton, and I recommend his video set. You can get your copy at 800-243-1438. The Innate Intelligence. What's it called? What's the title of it?
The Science of Innate Intelligence.
The Science of Innate Intelligence. You can also call in at 800-485-1922 as we continue the conversation. I'm Laura Lee here on The Laura Lee Show with biologist Bruce Lipton. What do some of the new studies in biology say about our world and ourselves? Oh, a lot. Let's go to the telephones and talk next with Pat. She's in Lincoln, Nebraska. Hi, Pat.
Hi, Laura. I really do like this subject. I've always been interested in philosophy, and I've been introduced to these sort of things through that. I've, studied a little bit about philosophy of science, but this kind of reminds me of communism in a way,
I'm sorry, we're
Lamarck
talking...
guy, he's kind of been inspirational for dialectical materialism, and you guys are talking about this, I mean, that's what it kind of sounds like slightly. I wish I could hear your comments on it. I have nothing against your talking about it, the metaphysics aspect about it, but I'm just kind of interested in what you say, about the criticism that might come about.
I'm unclear as to what you're saying. We talked about Lamarck as being one of the early proponents of evolutionary theory, and then Bruce said that it was with Wallace and Lamarck's theories together that Darwin came up with his own theory of evolution. Bruce, what's communism and dialectical materialism?
Well, I'll tell you what happened is that the Western science immediately adopted Darwin's theory as that was the law, the dogma, okay? Anybody who challenges the dogma is called a heretic. John Cairns, this biologist that I talked about who published that paper in Nature, because the implications of his paper are so profound that in the journal Science, which is the American equivalent of Nature, the journal Science, the week after John Cairns' article appeared in Nature, Science wrote an editorial about John Cairns, and interestingly enough, the title of the article was "A Heresy in Evolutionary Biology." And you see, they immediately threw out heretic kind of charges against him, because anybody who seems to upset the dogma really irritates the people who control the dogma, I guess. And Lamarck's theories were picked up by the Russians a long time ago. And so while Western science disregarded Lamarck as a buffoon, and that was an error, total error, because there's a history behind it. It's a great story. We consider him a buffoon because we've been led to believe that he was like the heretic of Charlie Darwin's view. And so we've always put him to the side, and the Russians picked him up because they saw the relationship in the environment like Barbara McClintock saw. But we didn't honor Barbara McClintock. We obviously didn't honor the Russian belief in it, so that Lamarckism got connected to communism, and that's not an appropriate connection of an academic understanding to a political profile right there. Because the truth is, if you want to make the connection, Darwinism is Nazi Germany, because that's what Adolf Hitler did, is he used Darwin's science to create a master race. So if you want to talk about Lamarck as a commie, well, you have to then talk about Darwin as a Nazi, and that's what we're doing, is we're confusing things. And so the philosophy of Lamarck is a scientific understanding, and basically what it says is that the organisms interact with the environment in an instructive way, so that as the environment changes, the organisms will adapt, and therefore life will stay alive on the planet, because if organisms couldn't adapt, then the radical upheavals that the Earth undergoes at those punctuated states would wipe out life entirely.
If we didn't have the ability to respond to the environment intelligently. And that's what Cairns was doing. John Cairns, you point out in 88.
In 1988, yeah.
Yeah, he's a geneticist, and his experiments were, well, the one that you cited was putting bacteria that could not metabolize lactase, a form of milk sugar, in a petri dish. And very shortly, they mutated to be able to eat the lactose. They had no other food, so it was either eat the lactose or die.
Absolutely, stress.
And go ahead. And in very short order, they were able to adapt. The whole group of them. This was directed mutation. So what you were saying is that there's some intelligence behind this, that cells. And then since then, you've pointed out that we found the gene that can actually rewrite.
There's a lot of genes that do it. Yeah.
So, and then you mentioned Barbara McClintock. She was the first one who 20 or 30 years ago won a Nobel Prize, since then, but for her discovery of the jumping gene, bacteria that can take, for example, the...
Well, she found them in corn plants, but they're all throughout nature. So right. She discovered the mechanism that that the genes are rewriting themselves on a daily basis to accommodate its perception, because nature's intelligent. It's not Darwinian, like, oh, this is a total accident, like we just threw genetic dice and, hey, we're here, and that was a lucky gamble. It's like, this is not a gamble, this is a direct interaction. And so the beautiful understanding about the new science is it's not divisive. It's not saying it's the inside, it's the outside. It brings them both together. And it says there is an energy of spirit, and there is the body, and they interact in a purposeful mechanism. Thus.
Okay, quick question then. Lamarck, who you mentioned, and how does this relate to the political systems of communism or Nazi? I didn't quite get that, but if you ever want to know, if you ever want an example of how our understandings of science influenced politics or philosophies of politics, is this a case of that?
Well, this is a great example of it, because basically the Russians were observing that the idea that they were looking at plants, that they were understanding that plants were adapting to their environment like in one generation, that if you took a plant and put it in a new environment, like a weird environment, and it was able to survive and pass on seeds, that the next generation of seeds were already adapted to that environment. So in one generation, they were capable of altering the seeds for the next generation.
biologist Bruce Lipton. This is the Lorelei Show, and it's a lecture that he gave at Holistic Health Forum, and he discusses a lot of these sciences, but most importantly, the implications of what it means and how we're now understanding much more about ourselves. As he's been telling us the last hour, DNA doesn't control us. DNA offers a realm of possibilities, but he says it's really our environment and our own reaction to the environment that can turn off or turn on the various DNA and how or which parts of it get expressed.
They recognize what a self is as being different than everything else, okay?
Yeah.
So basically I say, if I have your liver cell and I have my liver cell, and we know now they're two different liver cells, and I subtract essentially everything that's the same, approximately the same, what my expectation is, what would be left behind would be where the difference is. Okay?
Well, you say that our cells have self-receptor sites, and you were talking about the example of organ donors, the recipients of donated organs. Our environment. How are we reacting to the environment? What are we doing around us? What about emotions? Now, Bruce has also told us that our cells have two types of receptors. They have receptors, meaning what you can plug in to give it the information to cause it to unfold or express. Two types of receptors, he's told us: molecular, meaning biochemical, and electromagnetic. That electromagnetic is what gets interesting here. Bruce was just discussing a caller's question about reincarnation. He's told us about these type of genes called transposons that can actually engineer mutations. There have been studies to confirm this, that we have within us, and most cells will have within them, genes that can intelligently adapt to new conditions in the environment, that can intelligently rewrite the code as you go. So this is some important new findings on not just nurture versus nature and that old debate, but really on what are we doing with your own views. Could you restate those on reincarnation, Bruce, and could you give us a quick recap of where we've been for our new listeners just joining us? Go ahead and take your time.
Okay, basically the fact is that cells have identity, and that's why we cannot exchange cells with each other, because your cells have an identity of your character, my cells have my identity, and if I put my cells into anybody else's body, their immune system will say, no, these are not,
They'll say,
they don't
foreign
match cells.
invader, kill it.
What's that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what